An exciting story of redemption, love, passion, and new beginnings, where the millionaire kisses his son's aunt. What he didn't expect was that his daughter recorded everything and decides to show it to his wife. But before telling this story, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching us from. Continuing. The sun was setting slowly over the Miller mansion, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink that contrasted with the coldness of the marble and crystal that adorned the property. On the second-floor veranda, Alice observed the preparations for another of the extravagant parties that her family used to host. The staff moved like industrious ants, carrying flower arrangements, glasses, and gleaming trays. It was as if they were setting a stage for another performance of the great farce that was the Miller family's life. At 17, Alice had already witnessed hundreds of these parties. She knew every movement of the social choreography that unfolded night after night. Her mother, Isabella, would emerge from her room wearing one of her designer dresses, her impeccably made-up face hiding sleepless nights and silent tears. Her father, Henry, would appear later, when the most important guests were already present, displaying that rehearsed smile that never reached his eyes. "Alice, dear, aren't you ready yet?" Isabella's voice cut through her thoughts like a crystal razor. "Guests will start arriving in an hour." Turning to face her mother, Alice found the reflection of her own loneliness in Isabella's brown eyes. "I was just watching the preparations. Mom, I'll get ready now." "Wear the blue dress I set aside for you," Isabella instructed, adjusting a strand of her daughter's hair with that mechanical touch that had long lost any trace of true affection. "We need to be flawless tonight. Your father closed an important deal today." Alice nodded, knowing that important deal was just another code to justify the constant need to maintain appearances. As she walked to her room, her thoughts wandered. To her Aunt Claire, who would certainly be the star of the night as she always was, there was something about her aunt that intrigued her, a mixture of elegance and mystery that seemed to hypnotize everyone around her. In the hallway, Alice crossed paths with one of the maids carrying an arrangement of white lilies. The sweet, intense perfume of the flowers reminded her of a conversation she had overheard a few weeks ago between her mother and her aunt. Words whispered with urgency, glances loaded with hidden meanings. At the time, she hadn't understood what it meant, but now every little detail was beginning to make sense like pieces of a dark puzzle. Alice's bedroom was her refuge, the only place where she could be herself. She sat at the antique dressing table, a gift from her grandmother, and began to prepare for another night of fake smiles and empty conversations. As she passed the makeup brush over her face, she observed her reflection in the mirror, the same green eyes as her father, her mother's delicate lips, a perfect genetic combination that masked the imperfection of her family. The blue dress that her mother had chosen was laid out on the king-size bed. It was beautiful, of course, like everything Isabella selected. Alice put it on mechanically, feeling the fine fabric slide over her skin like a second mask. When she finished getting ready, the sun had completely disappeared, giving way to a clear, starry night. The first guests were beginning to arrive, their luxury cars forming an impeccable line at the entrance to the mansion. From her room, Alice could hear the growing murmur, the artificial laughter, the clinking of glasses. It was like a familiar symphony, a song she knew by heart, but had never really appreciated. She descended the main staircase with the grace that years of etiquette lessons had taught her. In the entrance hall, Henry was conversing with a group of executives, his imposing bearing dominating the environment. Upon seeing her, he gave a brief nod, the maximum attention he usually gave his daughter on public occasions. That's when she saw her. Claire had just entered, wearing a red dress that seemed to have been made for her. Her characteristic perfume, a mixture of jasmine and something deeper and more mysterious, preceded her arrival. The gazes of those present automatically turned to her, as if they were attracted by an invisible magnetic field. "Alice, my dear niece." Claire embraced her with that warmth that always seemed genuine, unlike the calculated gestures of her parents. "You look stunning in this dress." For a fleeting moment, Alice noticed something different in the look her aunt gave toward Henry. It was just a second, but it was there, an intensity that made her heart inexplicably race. She watched as Claire approached her father, greeting him with a kiss on the cheek that lasted a fraction of a second longer than it should have. Isabella appeared next to her husband, her smile frozen on her face as she observed the interaction between the two. Alice noticed how her mother's fingers closed more tightly around the champagne flute, how her eyes narrowed slightly. They were subtle details that most people wouldn't notice, but to Alice, who grew up studying every nuance of her parents' behavior, they were as clear as day. The evening progressed like a well-rehearsed play. Guests circulated through halls, decorated with rare orchids and expensive works of art. The music from the small orchestra floated through the air, mingling with the murmur of conversations and the occasional tinkling of glasses. Alice observed everything with attentive eyes, capturing each furtive glance, each seemingly casual touch. At one point, she saw her father discreetly move away toward his office on the second floor. Minutes later, Claire also disappeared from the party. To any casual observer, they would be just two coincidental absences at a busy party. But something inside Alice screamed that there was more to this situation than it appeared. Driven by a curiosity that surpassed her usual caution, Alice began to climb the stairs, her delicate sandals making no noise against the Persian carpet. The second-floor corridor was dark and silent, a stark contrast to the bustle of the party downstairs. She approached her father's office, her heart beating so hard that it seemed everyone could hear it. The door was ajar, letting a strip of golden light escape. Alice approached silently, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. It was then that she heard it, low, urgent voices, laden with an emotion she had never heard in her father's voice before. "We can't continue like this." "Claire," Henry's voice sounded hoarse, different from his habitually controlled tone. "It's getting harder and harder. You think it's easy for me?" Claire's voice trembled slightly. "To see you with her every day, pretending I don't feel anything." Alice froze, her entire body paralyzed by the shock of the revelation unfolding before her. Through the door crack, she could partially see the reflection of her father and her aunt in the large wall mirror. They were close, very close, their breaths mingling in the charged air of the office. That's when it happened. As if moved by a force greater than their own will, Henry and Claire moved even closer, their lips meeting in a desperate, forbidden kiss. Alice felt her world spin, but she couldn't look away. Her cell phone weighed in the pocket of her dress, and before she could think about the consequences, she was recording the scene through the crack in the door. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made her abruptly retreat. Storing the phone with trembling hands, Alice moved away as silently as possible, her heart threatening to leap from her chest. She managed to reach her room without being seen, closing the door behind her and sliding to the floor, her legs no longer able to support her. The truth she had just discovered weighed on her chest like a stone. Her father and her aunt. Her mother's look. The coincidental absences. Everything made terrible sense now, and in her hands, stored on her phone, was the power to destroy everything her family had built. That night, lying in her bed still wearing the blue dress, Alice stared at the ceiling of her room while the party continued downstairs. The video on her phone seemed to pulse like a time bomb. A decision needed to be made, and she knew that whatever her choice, nothing would be the same again at the Miller mansion. The following morning dawned grey, as if the sky itself reflected the storm forming in Alice's heart. She hadn't slept. Her hands still trembled each time she picked up her phone and saw the notification of the saved video. The sounds of the party had dissipated hours ago, leaving only the heavy silence that now hung over the Miller mansion. Sitting on her bed, still wearing the silk nightgown, Alice could hear the staff cleaning up the vestiges of the previous night. The distant tinkling of glasses being collected, the dragging of furniture returning to its place, the routine of the mansion following its course as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She picked up the phone for the 10th time. That morning, her fingers sliding over the screen until she found the video. The image of her father and her aunt, frozen in the first frame, seemed to mock her. How could she carry that secret? How could she look into her mother's eyes knowing what she knew? It was then that she heard voices coming from the corridor. She immediately recognized Isabella's controlled tone, giving instructions to the housekeeper about breakfast. Alice felt her heart accelerate. Her mother, always so composed, so dedicated to maintaining appearances. Did she deserve to know the truth? The weight of the decision suffocated her. With trembling hands, Alice opened the messaging app. She looked at her mother's name in the contact list, feeling a mixture of guilt and determination. Before she could change her mind, she selected the video and pressed send. The soft sound of the message being delivered sounded like a final sentence. Seconds later, she heard Isabella's phone ring in the corridor. The sound of footsteps ceased. The silence that followed was deafening. Alice held her breath, counting the seconds. Then came the sound, a glass object shattering against the floor, followed by a muffled scream that Alice would never forget. Mrs. Isabella? The alarmed voice of the housekeeper echoed through the corridor. Are you all right? There was no answer, just the sound of heels furiously beating against the marble floor, moving away toward the master bedroom. Alice stood up, her wobbly legs barely supporting her weight. Through the half-open door, she saw her mother pass like a hurricane, her normally controlled face contorted into a mask of pain and fury. The sound of the master bedroom door being violently closed reverberated through the mansion. Alice went out into the corridor, finding the housekeeper still standing, looking confused at the shards of a crystal vase scattered across the floor. "Don't worry, Mrs. Davis. I'll clean this." "Up," Alice said, her voice trembling slightly. The housekeeper nodded, still concerned, and reluctantly moved away. As she collected the crystal shards, Alice could hear muffled sounds coming from her parents' bedroom. Her mother's voice, normally so controlled, now sounded choked and furious. She was shouting on the phone, and even through the thick walls Alice could distinguish isolated words. "How could you? My own husband. My own sister." The sound of the doorbell cut through the air like a knife. Alice froze, still holding the crystal shards. Through the corridor window, she saw Claire's car parking at the entrance to the mansion. Her aunt stepped out of the vehicle looking as elegant as always, apparently oblivious to the chaos she was about to encounter. The following minutes unfolded like a slow-motion movie scene. Alice watched, paralyzed at the top of the stairs, as Claire was led by the housekeeper to the entrance hall. At the same moment, the master bedroom door opened violently, and Isabella emerged, her red eyes contrasting with the deadly paleness of her face. "How dare you appear in my house?" Isabella's voice cut through the air like a whip. Claire stopped in the middle of the hall, her expression changing from surprise to understanding in a matter of seconds. "Isabella, I can explain," Claire began, but was interrupted by a bitter laugh from Isabella. "Explain, explain?" Isabella descended the stairs with surprising speed, stopping inches from Claire. "Explain what exactly? How you and my husband have been making a fool of me? How you laughed at me behind my back?" "It's not like that, Isabella. It's much more complicated than you think." Claire tried to maintain her composure, but her voice trembled slightly. "Complicated?" Isabella took her phone and practically shoved it in Claire's face. "Does this seem complicated to you?" Claire's face lost all color upon seeing the video. Her eyes climbed the stairs and found Alice, who was still paralyzed at the top, holding the crystal shards. For a moment, aunt and niece stared at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. "Where is Henry?" Claire asked, her voice now firmer. "Ah, your lover?" Isabella spat the words with venom. "Probably hiding in his office like the coward he's always been. But don't worry, he won't be able to hide for long." As if summoned by Isabella's words, Henry appeared at the top of the stairs, his normally impassive face now marked by an expression of defeat. "Enough, Isabella, you don't need to make a scene." "A scene?" Isabella turned to face him, her eyes flashing with anger. "You think this is a scene? You haven't seen anything yet, darling. When I'm finished, nothing will be left of the reputation you prize so much. Nothing of the empire you built at the cost of my suffering." Alice watched the scene unfold, feeling simultaneously guilty and relieved. The secret had been revealed, but the price seemed too high. Her father descended the stairs slowly, each step seeming to cost him an immense effort. "Isabella, please, let's talk in private," Henry tried, his voice softer than normal. "Private?" Isabella laughed, a humorless sound that made Alice shudder. "Like the private meetings you had with my sister." "No, Henry, the time for secrets in this house is over." Claire stepped forward, her elegant posture beginning to falter. "This started long before you, Isabella. Henry and I—" "Shut up!" Isabella's scream echoed through the mansion. Don't you dare try to justify this abomination. You are siblings, for God's sake." "Half-siblings," Henry corrected automatically, and at the same moment realized his mistake. The sound of the slap that Isabella dealt to Henry's face reverberated through the hall like a gunshot. Alice let the crystal shards fall, the noise of the glass shattering, again marking the moment when her family began to definitively crumble. "Leave," Isabella ordered, her voice now dangerously low. "Both of you, leave my house now." "This is my house too," Henry began, but Isabella cut him off with a look that could freeze hell. "Not for long, darling. You can be sure not for long." Alice watched her father and her aunt exchange a meaningful look before heading to the door. When they passed by her, still at the top of the stairs, Claire paused briefly. "Forgive me, dear," she whispered, her eyes watery. "We never wanted you to find out like this." Before Alice could respond, Isabella appeared again. "Out! Now!" When the front door finally closed, the silence that fell over the Miller mansion was deafening. Alice looked at her mother, who had collapsed into one of the armchairs in the hall, her body shaking with contained sobs. At that moment, Alice realized that there was much more to this story than a simple case of betrayal. There were decades of secrets, of forbidden loves, and of carefully constructed lies. And now, because of her, everything was exposed, naked and raw, like an open wound that would never completely heal. The days that followed the explosive revelation were like a slow-motion nightmare at the Miller mansion. The deafening silence was broken only by the occasional sound of slamming doors and incessantly ringing phones. Isabella had locked herself in her room, emerging only for meetings with her lawyers, her face marked by deep circles that no makeup could disguise. Alice wandered the corridors of the mansion like a ghost, carrying the weight of guilt for having been the trigger of all that destruction. The staff whispered in corners, exchanging meaningful glances when she passed by. News of the scandal was beginning to spread through the closest social circles, and Alice could feel the judgmental looks even through the thick marble walls. On a particularly grey morning, while having her solitary breakfast in the immense dining room, Alice was surprised by her mother's arrival. Isabella entered the room like a dethroned queen, still maintaining her proud posture despite the circumstances. "We need to talk," Isabella announced, sitting at the table with a steaming cup of tea. "About your father, and about Claire." Alice felt her stomach turn. "Mom, No, let me speak first," Isabella interrupted her, her voice controlled but trembling slightly. "There are things you need to know, things that happened long before you were born." Isabella took a sip of tea, her hands shaking slightly as she placed the cup on the porcelain saucer. "Henry and Claire, they aren't just half-siblings, they grew up separately. Claire was raised by her mother in New York, while Henry stayed here with his father. They only met as teenagers when Claire returned to Boston." Alice listened attentively, each word from her mother helping to assemble the puzzle that was her family. "And that's when they fell in love?" "Yes," Isabella completed, a bitter smile playing on her lips. "I didn't know, of course. When I met Henry in law school, he seemed like the perfect man. Successful, charming, determined. Claire had already returned to New York by that time, after the family discovered their relationship." "Why are you telling me this now?" Alice asked, her voice just a whisper. "Because you need to understand that sometimes love can be a curse," Isabella replied, her eyes fixed on a distant point. "I loved your father, Alice, truly loved him. But he was never able to love me the same way. His heart always belonged to her. The sound of the doorbell interrupted the conversation. Seconds later, Mrs. Davis, the housekeeper, appeared at the library door. "Mrs. Isabella, Mr. Richard is here for Sunday lunch." It was a new tradition they had established in recent weeks. Sunday family lunches, where they tried to rebuild their bonds in a different, more honest way. Henry entered the library carrying a folder of documents. His face, previously always marked by constant tension, seemed lighter, more serene. "I brought something to show you both," he announced, sitting in one of the armchairs. "I received a letter from Claire yesterday." Alice felt her mother stiffen slightly beside her, but Isabella maintained her composure. "Is she well?" Alice asked, genuinely interested. "She is," Henry smiled softly. "She's teaching art at a school in New York. Says she's finally found her place." He paused, looking directly at Isabella. "She also asked me to tell you something, Isabella." "Me?" Isabella asked, surprised. "Yes. She wrote that she would like to ask for your forgiveness. Not through me, but personally. She plans to come to Boston next month to resolve some pending issues and would like to see you, if you'll allow it, of course." A heavy silence fell over the library. Alice observed her mother attentively, trying to decipher her emotions. "And you, Henry?" Isabella finally asked. "How do you feel about this?" "Honestly," he sighed, "I think it's necessary, for all of us. Forgiveness. It frees not only the forgiven, but especially the one who forgives." Isabella stood up, walking to the large window that overlooked the garden. Her roses, freshly pruned, were beginning to show new buds. "Perhaps," she said finally, "perhaps it is indeed time to properly close this cycle." Alice felt silent tears running down her face. It was as if a final knot, a final weight, was beginning to loosen. "Mrs. Davis," Isabella called. The housekeeper appeared promptly. "Could you serve lunch in the garden today? It's too beautiful a day to stay inside." As they headed to the garden, Alice noticed how her parents walked close to each other, not as a couple but as two friends who had survived a long and difficult journey together. The love they had shared was no longer romantic, but had transformed into something equally valuable: respect, understanding, forgiveness. Seated at the garden table under the gentle shade of an old oak tree, the three began to plan how this reunion with Claire would be. There was no more bitterness in their voices, only the cautious expectation of those preparing to turn an important page in their history. Isabella's roses swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, their petals reflecting the sunlight like small mirrors. Alice thought about how the flowers were similar to them. Even after being pruned almost to the root, they found the strength to bloom again, stronger and more beautiful than before. The day of Claire's return arrived with a fine, steady rain, typical of Boston autumn. The Miller mansion was immersed in an atmosphere of contained expectation. Isabella had spent the entire morning rearranging flower arrangements, adjusting pillows, as if trying to occupy her hands to calm her thoughts. Alice observed the preparations with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Her mother had chosen to receive Claire at the mansion, a gesture that symbolized both strength and generosity. The meeting was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon, and each passing minute seemed to drag on with agonizing slowness. "Do you think she's changed much?" Alice asked her mother, as she helped arrange the porcelain cups in the living room. "People like Claire never really change," Isabella replied, adjusting a white rose in the central arrangement. "They just evolve." The sound of tires on the gravel driveway made them both freeze. Through the window they saw Henry's car parking. He had offered to pick Claire up at the airport, a decision that generated long discussions in recent weeks. "Are you ready?" Alice asked softly, noticing how her mother nervously wrung her hands. "No," Isabella replied with a trembling smile. "But when are we ever really ready to face our ghosts?" The sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion. Mrs. Davis, who seemed as nervous as everyone else, hurried to open the door. Alice could hear voices in the entrance hall, the sound of Claire's heels on the marble floor, her father's deep voice giving instructions about the luggage, and then she entered. Claire was different, but not in the way Alice expected. There was something in her eyes, a serenity that wasn't there before. Her smile, always dazzling, now seemed more restrained, more genuine. "Isabella," she said softly, stopping a few steps away, "thank you for receiving me." The silence that followed was dense, laden with years of hurt and secrets. Isabella took a step forward, her face a mask of composure. "Welcome, Claire," she replied, her voice surprisingly firm. The two women studied each other for a moment, like fighters evaluating their opponents before a decisive combat. It was Claire who spoke first. "I spent the last few months trying to find the right words for this moment," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I rehearsed speeches, wrote letters I never sent. But now, looking at you, I realize that no words would be enough." "No," Isabella agreed. "Words are never enough to explain the inexplicable." "I didn't come to ask you to understand me," Claire continued, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Not even to forgive me. I came just to say I'm sorry. Deeply. Truly, I'm sorry." Henry, who had remained silent near the door, took a hesitant step toward the two women. Alice noticed how her father seemed divided, as if he didn't know what his role was in that scene. "We all make mistakes," Isabella said finally, her voice softening. "Some bigger than others. But you know what I learned in these months, Claire? That holding a grudge is like drinking poison, and expecting the other person to die." A sob escaped Claire's lips. Isabella, in a gesture that surprised everyone, extended her hand and lightly touched her sister's arm. "I hated you," she continued. "Hated you with all my strength. But hatred, it consumes just as much as the forbidden love that you and Henry shared." "Isabella," Henry began, but she interrupted him with a gesture. "Let me finish, please. You two carried a love that should never have existed. But it did. And me? I carried the weight of knowing, of pretending not to know, of trying to compete with a ghost. We were all prisoners, in one way or another." Alice watched the scene, feeling her heart tighten with every word. Her mother continued, "But now? Now we are all free. You are free to live your life in New York. Henry is free to be the father he always should have been, and I am free to simply be myself." Claire wiped away the tears that flowed freely down her face. "You are an extraordinary woman, Isabella. You always have been. I just wish things had been different." "But they weren't," Isabella replied simply. "And maybe that's for the best. Sometimes we need to lose everything to find who we really are." The sound of rain against the windows filled the silence that followed. Alice approached her aunt, allowing herself to be enveloped in an embrace that smelled of longing and regret. "How long will you stay?" she asked, her voice muffled against Claire's shoulder. "Just a few days," Claire replied, pulling back to look into her niece's eyes. "I have some matters to resolve, and then—" She hesitated, glancing briefly at Henry before continuing. "Then I returned to my new life in New York." Henry nodded slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture of understanding and acceptance. Alice realized that something important was happening there, a silent farewell, a definitive goodbye to the love they had shared. "Would you like some tea?" Isabella suddenly asked, breaking the tension of the moment. "Mrs. Davis prepared that. Orange cake you always liked." The simple, almost banal gesture carried a profound meaning. It was an invitation for a new beginning, a chance to transform years of hurt into something different, something lighter. As they settled in the living room, the rain outside began to diminish. A stubborn ray of sunlight managed to break through, the clouds illuminating the white roses at the center of the table. Alice thought about how that moment was like their lives. After the storm, a ray of light, the promise of better days. But there was something in Claire's eyes, a fleeting shadow, that appeared when she looked at Henry, that made Alice wonder if that story had really come to an end. Do some loves, even forbidden ones, even impossible ones, never completely die? The morning of Claire's departure dawned with a dense fog that covered Boston like a cloak of mystery. Alice woke before sunrise, her hands trembling as she got ready. She had decided to go to the airport, not so much for Claire but for herself. She needed closure, an endpoint to that story that had turned her life upside down. Downstairs, she found her mother already awake, sitting in the living room with an untouched cup of tea in her hands. Isabella raised her eyes when her daughter entered, a small sad smile playing on her lips. "So you're going then?" she asked softly. "I need to go," Alice replied, sitting next to her mother. "I need to see her leave to believe that all of this is real." Isabella nodded, placing the cup on the coffee table. "I understand, more than you can imagine." She paused, as if carefully choosing her next words. "Your aunt, Claire. She's not a bad person, Alice. She just made wrong choices. As we all have." "How can you be so understanding?" Alice asked, surprised by her mother's serenity. "Age, perhaps," Isabella smiled sadly. "Or maybe because I finally understood that love, sometimes, is more complex than we would like it to be." The sound of a car approaching caught the attention of both women. Through the window, they saw Henry's driver parking at the entrance to the mansion. "Your father is going with you," Isabella informed, her voice neutral. "He needs this closure as much as you do." Alice felt her heart tighten. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" "No," Isabella answered honestly. "But some things need to happen even if they hurt." The journey to the airport was silent. Henry kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. Alice watched the city pass by through the window, the fog beginning to dissipate as the sun gained strength. They arrived at the international terminal with 30 minutes to spare. Claire was already there, elegant as always in an impeccable travel outfit. Upon seeing them, her face lit up with a sad smile. "You came," she said softly, approaching. "We couldn't let you leave without saying goodbye," Alice replied, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. Claire looked at Henry, who remained a few steps behind, as if afraid to get too close. "Henry." "No," he interrupted her, his voice hoarse. "Don't say anything. Please." The announcement of Claire's flight echoed through the terminal, making all three of them shudder. It was time. "Alice?" Claire turned to her niece, tears shining in her eyes. "I know I have no right to ask anything, but take care of him for me?" She indicated Henry with a discreet nod of her head. Alice felt her own tears begin to fall. "I will take care of him, but not for you, for myself." Claire nodded, a proud smile playing on her lips. "You are stronger than all of us put together. You know?" She approached Henry one last time, maintaining a respectful distance. "Goodbye, my love," she whispered, so softly that only he could hear. Henry closed his eyes tightly, as if experiencing physical pain. When he opened them again, there was a new determination in his gaze. "Goodbye, Claire," he responded, his voice firm. "Be happy." Alice watched her aunt walk toward the boarding gate, her elegant figure progressively becoming smaller until completely disappearing. Beside her, her father let out a deep sigh as if releasing years of pent-up tension. "Shall we go home?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Yes," Alice replied, linking her arm with his. "Let's go home." The way back was different. The fog had completely dissipated, revealing a sky of intense blue. Alice noticed that her father was driving more slowly, as if he were really seeing the city for the first time in a long time. "Dad," she called softly, "what happens now?" Henry was silent for a few moments before answering. "Now, my daughter, we begin again. All of us." When they arrived at the mansion, they found Isabella in the garden, pruning her roses with an almost fierce concentration. Upon seeing them, she stopped, her hands still holding the gardening shears. "She's gone?" she asked simply. "She's gone," Henry replied, his voice laden with meaning. Isabella nodded, turning her attention back to the roses. "These need to be pruned to grow stronger," she commented, more to herself than to them. "Sometimes even what seems healthy needs to be cut for something new to be born." Alice looked at her parents, two people who had built a life together, even if on fragile foundations. Now those foundations had crumbled, but perhaps, just perhaps, something more genuine could emerge from the ruins. "I'll prepare coffee for us," she announced, surprising her parents. "I think we need to talk about everything." Isabella put down the gardening shears, a small smile appearing on her lips. "Yes, dear, I think it's time." Henry looked at the two women in his life and for the first time in many days felt a pang of hope. The love he had dedicated to Claire for so many years had departed with her that morning, but perhaps there was room in his heart for a different kind of love, a more mature, more conscious love. A love of a father and a friend. As they headed into the mansion, the sun shone with full force, warming the gardens and making Isabella's freshly pruned roses gleam with the morning dew. It was a new day at the Miller mansion, and with it, the promise of a fresh start. 6 months passed since Claire's departure. The Miller mansion, once a stage for secrets and lies, now breathed a different air. The changes were subtle, but profound. The oppressive silence had been replaced by a lighter, almost contemplative silence. The gardens, under Isabella's increasingly dedicated care, bloomed with renewed vigor. On that Sunday afternoon, Alice observed her mother through the library window. Isabella was engaged in her new Sunday ritual, personally tending to her roses, without gardening gloves, allowing her fingers to feel each thorn, each petal. It was her form of therapy, she had explained once. Feeling the pain of the thorns reminded her that she was alive, that she could feel that she was moving forward. The divorce process had been surprisingly civilized. Henry, perhaps in an attempt at redemption, had agreed to all the terms proposed by Isabella. The mansion would remain with her, as well as a considerable portion of the company shares. He had moved to an apartment downtown, close to the office, but came regularly to visit Alice. The relationship between father and daughter was gradually being rebuilt, this time on more honest foundations. Henry had started therapy, something he had always considered unnecessary in the past. In his conversations with Alice, now more frequent and profound, he was beginning to open up about his own traumas, about the weight of carrying a forbidden love for so many years, about his fears and regrets. "What are you thinking about?" Isabella's voice surprised Alice. Her mother had entered the library silently, still wearing her gardening apron, small patches of soil marking the light fabric. "About how everything has changed," Alice replied honestly. "About how we have changed." Isabella sat in the armchair next to her daughter, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "You know, sometimes I think we should thank Claire." Alice looked at her mother with surprise. "Thank her?" "Yes," Isabella smiled slightly. "Her departure forced us to face truths we had been ignoring for years. It forced me to face my own cowardice." "Cowardice?" Alice asked, confused. "You are the strongest person I know, Mom." "No, dear, I was just proud. I knew about your father and Claire for much longer than I admitted. I chose to pretend I didn't see, that I didn't know. I thought that if I ignored it, the problem would disappear." Alice absorbed this new information in silence. Her mother continued. "But you know what I discovered in these last few months, that there is a much greater strength in accepting the truth, however painful it may be, than in pretending it doesn't exist." The sound of the doorbell interrupted the conversation. Moments later, Mrs. Davis, the housekeeper, appeared at the door of the library. "Mrs. Isabella, Mr. Henry is here for Sunday lunch." It was a new tradition they had established in recent weeks. Sunday family lunches, where they tried to rebuild their bonds in a different, more honest way. Henry entered the library carrying a folder of documents. His face, previously always marked by constant tension, seemed lighter, more serene. "I brought something to show you," he announced, sitting in one of the armchairs. "I received a letter from Claire yesterday." Alice felt her mother stiffen slightly beside her, but Isabella maintained her composure. "Is she well?" Alice asked, genuinely interested. "She is," Henry smiled softly. "She's teaching art at a school in New York. Says she finally found her place." He paused, looking directly at Isabella. "She also asked me to tell you something, Isabella." "Me?" Isabella asked, surprised. "Yes. She wrote that she would like to ask for your forgiveness. Not through me, but personally. She plans to come to Boston next month to resolve some pending issues and would like to see you, if you'll allow it, of course." A heavy silence fell over the library. Alice observed her mother attentively, trying to decipher her emotions. "And you, Henry?" Isabella finally asked. "How do you feel about this?" "Honestly," he sighed, "I think it's necessary for all of us. Forgiveness. It frees not only the one who is forgiven, but especially the one who forgives." Isabella stood up, walking to the large window that overlooked the garden. Her roses, freshly pruned, were beginning to show new buds. "Perhaps," she said finally, "perhaps it is indeed time to properly close this cycle." Alice felt silent tears running down her face. It was as if a final knot, a final weight, was beginning to loosen. "Mrs. Davis," Isabella called. The housekeeper appeared promptly. "Could you serve lunch in the garden today? It's too beautiful a day to stay inside." As they headed to the garden, Alice noticed how her parents walked close to each other, not as a couple but as two friends who had survived a long and difficult journey together. The love they had shared was no longer romantic, but had transformed into something equally valuable: respect, understanding, forgiveness. Seated at the garden table under the gentle shade of an old oak tree, the three began to plan how this reunion with Claire would be. There was no more bitterness in their voices, only the cautious expectation of those preparing to turn an important page in their history. Isabella's roses swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, their petals reflecting the sunlight like small mirrors. Alice thought about how the flowers were similar to them. Even after being pruned almost to the root,